welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 36 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I want to talk about fascism and discuss the notion whether fascism was an ideology of the left or an ideology of the right, because there's a big debate about this, right? Um, Coming in especially from both the classical liberal circles and the communist circles, both of them debating. We have a sort of a political dialogue currently in America that's very, um, you know, very turbulent right now. Each political ideology calling each other fascist, which is interesting to me. The right calls the left fascist, the left calls the right fascist. The word is thrown around, and I find it strange because. Um, everything that the West has become has really been more of communistic tendencies, at least the liberal West. And yet the word fascism is the word that's preferred in terms of, trying to throw detrimental insult out to people. And and as I've always told you guys, fascism doesn't exist anymore. Fascism was an ideology purely of Italians, particularly of Giovanni Gentile, who was the philosopher of fascism, and of course the practical applicator of fascism, which was Benito Mussolini during his governance between 1922 and 1943. Nowhere else, I think, can fascism ever be proclaimed anywhere in any other time period in history. Not even Franco in Spain was a fascist in its truest sense. Not even Hitler in Germany was a fascist in its truest sense. In fact, the Nazis and the Italian fascists really didn't like each other all that much. That's how serious the disagreements between both ideologies were. Now, obviously, there were some similarities, but that is because Mussolini was in power for 10 years before the Fuhrer came into power, and let's call it almost 20 years before Franco came into power. And obviously, the Roman genius, as he was called, as he was admired by a lot of people all over the world, this is before World War II, there was a lot that those nations took from Mussolini. Again, that doesn't make them fascist, but they borrowed a lot of the ideas, and so we kind of make these simplistic judgments when in terms of history, especially with a lot of liberals that are defending, again, sort of, the sort of democratic capitalist world that we cherish as something that's um, I guess, divine origin of sorts, as many classical liberals put it. Those are our cherished values. And so but fascism to me is it's a tough one to make and understand, and whether it's the left or right. I think the first problem you have is simple, just different basic philosophical concepts that are misunderstood. The first of which is that when you look at capitalism and communism, in some ways, they really are two sides of the same coin. They're both materialistically based, and they're all about the transactional process of the material world, right? On the communist front, you have, again, the seizing of private property and the means of production, if you want to call it that, into the hands of centralized authority. In the West, you have basically the greatest good as the economic transaction of capitalism that gives us all this great materialism, which eventually devolves into control of most of the assets into the hands of the oligarchs. And so when everything is understood based upon this sort of material dialectic, right? When everything is transactional, it's going to be difficult for these two ideological principles to understand that fascism was more than simply an economic system. It tried to encompass a bigger principle of life. It was actually opposed those two ideologies precisely because it saw them purely as transactional, and this is why they always argued and fought with each other, creating great disruption, particularly all over Europe, since at least the French Revolution. For the fascists, I think you have a situation where they try to encompass something more and bigger, obviously economics being important, but they try to encompass a national identity, culture, faith, family, history, bloodlines, ethnicity, all these things mattered. It was a more comprehensive ideology. Now, how they put all this together is what we discuss here, or at least we try to discuss. But again, um, when we're coming at it from this, classical liberal trying to make or help Americans understand what it was, viewing it from this, basic transactional economic perspective makes it tough oftentimes to make people understand this. And so I'm going to turn here to Nicholas Farrell, all right? Mussolini in New Life. Now, for those of you guys that don't know who Nicholas Farrell is, he writes for um, the Spectator, the American Spectator in Europe, the European version of that. He's Englishman, married an Italian woman, moved to Italy, and actually lived in Mussolini's hometown of Prepadapio for 5 years, I believe he said. And that's where he got to study fascism and Mussolini. And he's got a great perspective on it. This is the very first book I read on Mussolini. It's a comprehensive book. It's a big book, and he covers a lot of information, every aspect of Mussolini's life and the ideas of fascism. And he got a good grasp of it. And what I love about the book is that it's very objective. It doesn't demonize Mussolini as an evil man, but it also doesn't canonize Mussolini as a saint. It really gives you the good and the bad with Mussolini. And I think, again, it's very objective. And I think that's a great place to start for people that want to learn more. And so, invariably, we deal with this issue. Again, the question was fascism or the right, or was it of the left? And this is what I'm going to try and make people understand. My position from the outset is it's nuanced. It's very nuanced. Okay. And as you're going to see right now, Farrell delves into some of this nuance. I think Farrell leans more on the side that it was of the left. He'll lean that way. For me, I think where Farrell misses the mark a little bit is that he doesn't include in his description social policies and morality, as you will see here, right? Because that is ultimately the counterbalance to the left and right paradigm. What is it? To the left? Is it to the right? Well, Farrell does a decent job here. Let me read this to you. Starting at page 153, very beginning of chapter 9. Hold on, guys. Let me put my glasses on here. Reading glasses. Name of the chapter is Power, Year One of the Fascist Era. I'm just going to read the first page here because he describes, or at least tries to give or explain whether fascism is of the left or of the right. Mussolini did not seize power. That was the fascist version of history. He was given power by the king. Nor was fascism a bourgeois counter-revolution against the working class. That was the Marxist version of history. The fascists opposed the bourgeoisie as much as they opposed the socialists because both exalted one class at the expense of the other. The fascists, the fascists exalted the nation, united, not divided. The popular definition of fascism as right wing is misleading, even though Mussolini in 1922 described it, quote, of the right. Now, see, that's interesting already. Let me stop there for a second. Because later on, toward the end of his life, Mussolini would say he was socialist at heart. But at the beginning of his administration, he says it's of the right, right? This is how nuanced this thing issue, this issue is here. Let me keep reading it, and you guys will get why. The intellectual driving force behind it was left wing, which is true. Most fascists had either been socialists or syndicalists. Now, let me stop there. Is syndicalism, right? Old world guild system syndicalism, is that socialism? Farrell says that it is. I would have to think about that more, research that more, because that was the economic system of the old world, which worked very well in Europe. But let me move on. However, right wing, the manifestation of fascism became, its guiding star was always of the left. Its opposition to socialism might be described as right wing. Its Republican tendencies, left wing. Its opposition to the principle of parliamentary democracy might be described as right wing. Its opposition to the undemocratic reality of the Italian parliament left wing. Its defense of private property was right wing, but its support for the big state to bridle capitalism, its corporate state left wing. Okay? Like the socialists, the fascists wanted class war. Theirs, however, was not a war between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but between productive people and parasitic people. They sought the victory not of the working class, but of productive people from whichever class they came. This meant, for example, collaboration between productive employers and productive workers, not confrontation. It was the fascists who made popular the phrase the third way, between the first and second ways, capitalism and socialism, to describe their corporate state, which would ensure class collaboration and end class war. Mussolini would write, the force of fascism consists of this, that it takes from all programs the vital part and has a force to put them into practice. It is ironical, therefore, that three-quarters of a century later, all the collapse of Eastern Bloc communism, that the fascist third way should become the leitmotif of the millennium left, whom the word fascist remains the worst of insults. Okay, let me stop there. So, you got a bunch of issues here, right? Is it of the left? Is it of the right? Okay. Well, it's corporate state to help bridle some of the excesses of capitalism. Yeah, I think that could be considered to the left. On the other hand, like he states here, private property. Fascists were big time in private property, and they were in favor of the rule of law, which I would consider right wing as well too. He talks about some elements of democracy, Republican, and in fighting socialism as left wing, right wing, but also again, as I would bring up, morality, right? The moral law. It gave that power to the church, ironically enough, right? And so, was it left wing or right wing? It's a mixed bag. That's just the reality of it. For me, I've always seen fascism as, um, and I agree here with Farrell, it was born of the left, right? It was a byproduct of a mixture between classical liberalism and Marxism, right? I believe that classical liberalism gives birth to Marxism in this battle between classical liberals and Marxists in the East and the West. You have a world in turmoil, and fascism is born as a reaction to this turmoil, right? And so fascism is a turn to the right, but it's an ideology born from the left, if that makes any sense to you. That's how I've always seen it. And so this is where fascism rises. Now, in terms of economics, because this is what basically this means, right? When we say it's a left wing or right wing, we're talking about economics, especially from this, again, communistic and classical liberal worldview that reduces everything down to the material transaction. So, if we're going to go down the path of Italian economics, particularly Mussolini's economics, there's a lot to be said because there's some good, there's some bad, and there's some major nuances, again, that have to be taken consideration of all the way around. Mussolini comes into power in 1922. He inherits a budget deficit. Previous government were a bunch of socialists that were implementing lots of socialist programs. Mussolini again rejects, sort of the leftist socialism policies, or those extreme policies at least. He comes in, he balanced the budgets. In his first 4 years, from 22 to 26, he basically uses a laissez-faire capitalist economics to balance the budget and ultimately pay off the national debt of Italy. We get to 1927. That's where we get some more regulations because that's where he begins to build his corporate estate. And it's here where the economic data is kind of murky, right? We have economic data. I have a book by Herbert Schneider, um, The Fascist Government of Italy. It kept data records up until 1936. Some good things happened under Mussolini. He brought them really out of being a backward third rate kind of a nation. He brought them into economic prosperity to a certain degree, even though there's ebbs and flows there, lots of big national projects, which tax increases started to happen after 1926. Lots of bureaucracy because it was a centralized government in some ways. In some ways, I don't believe it was. I got to be honest, I don't believe it was a stronger central government than what we have in the United States today, but we could debate that. Um, but what we see in some of the economic numbers is that the wage issue or the living wage issue for the average Italian, it went up, it went down. It's kind of a bunch of mixed numbers at the end of the day. But again, this comes with a lot of nuance because it's hard to figure out. And listen, I could take an estimated guess here, and that is that corporatism would have been much more prosperous than a complete government controlled system like we see in communism, that's for sure, but it would have been definitely less productive than a more laissez-faire capitalist system, even with all of its abuses. I believe that corporatism probably would have finished somewhere in between. And again, because we're judging everything simply by the material transaction, that would put fascism as sort of a moral deficit for classical liberals. But again, the fascists were trying to achieve more than simple economic prosperity. They understood economic prosperity was very important, but there was a grander goal to fascism that I think has to be considered at the end of the day. And so you do got a big bureaucratic state, and one of the things that suffers right away is bureaucracy is a big problem in Italy, and Mussolini trying to control that bureaucracy, which a lot of people say that he didn't do it very well. But I think the issue is this though. Why Italian economics between 1927 and 1943, by the time Mussolini is ousted by the king, why it's problematic, I think, especially with the statistics and the numbers that people say is kind of give and take, some good, some bad, is you have some major events happening in that time because of where the state of the world was. The first of which is Italy. And Italy was a nation that was very agrarian, a massive peasant class. That was the first thing. It was a newer nation that was still trying to find its identity. What was an Italian in 1922 when Mussolini came into power? Nobody really knew, right? The question Romana hadn't been settled, right? There was a separation between the church, the state, and the different provinces of the different Italian provinces that had different customs, traditions, languages that was in some ways artificially put together by Garibaldi during the Risorgimento, the Italian Revolution in the 1860s. And trying to understand this and put a peasant nation together to make it work economically wasn't going to be very, very easy to begin with. And Mussolini did deal with the Roman question, right? The question Romana and the Lateran Accords that was negotiated between 26 and 29. Notice the years here, right? 26 and 29 was settled. Italians had finally been given an identity. We now knew, right, through the Lateran Accords what an Italian was, really, right? And then 1929, the Great Depression hits. So Mussolini enacts his or tries to enact his corporate state in 27. He's negotiating line accords up until 29. We get Italian identity, and the same year the Great Depression hits, right? And any economic, what do you want to call it, metrics that we can judge already by 29 is already very difficult to judge. That's number one. Number two, unlike what I call the empire nations, America, Soviet Union, Britain, France, that have colonies all over the world and they have natural resources from here to kingdom come, Italy, as a newer nation that did not partake in colonialism early on, and when it did, it got really the crap left over, let's be honest here, just didn't have natural resources, or at least the vital natural resources that all the other empire nations had. It didn't have steel, it didn't have coal, it didn't have oil, and all those high-paying jobs and sort of the resources that those industries bring to the nation wasn't available to the Italian people and the Italian government at the end of the day. The high-paying jobs weren't there. Many Italians were simply stuck with their peasant fishing jobs like my grandfather, or their construction jobs like my father was, or they were agrarian and they were simple farmers. That's what they were. I mean, there was real problem. This is why Italians continue to emigrate, right? Leave Italy to go to other nations because you simply didn't have these industries. So it was, again, a nation that was newer. It didn't have the ability in a post-industrial world to compete with other nations because of lack of resources. Later on, this is what would drive Mussolini into the Hitler camp when it came to World War II, because the moment Franklin Roosevelt created an embargo against Italy over Ethiopia at the begging of the British, Mussolini had nowhere else to go into the Hitler camp because Hitler promised him the oil, the coal, and the steel. But in terms of economics, you don't have that same kind of job base as you would in America that had all these natural resources. So here you have the the corporatist system that's established in 27. Um, in 29, Italians get their identity through the question Romana, but that same year, the Great Depression hits. Couple that with no natural resources or very little natural resources, right? And then by 1939, actually, no. 1936, Italy starts entering wars, right? World War II might as well have begun in 19, let's call it end of 35, early 36, with its entrance not only to Ethiopia, but helping Franco out in Spain. And by the time we get to 1939, World War II breaks out. You see how complicated this is to judge Italian economics in that period. That's why when people say, well, they did good, but the peasants, they lost their working conditions, their living wages went down, it's a little bit more difficult, especially with all these things going on. And even with that, there was no real call, and I think this is the best metric of judgment. There was no real call to oust Mussolini. There was something else that Mussolini gave the Italian people, right? There was no real uprising against Mussolini, despite the claims that it's a mixed bag with economics and it wasn't as prosperous as, say, the capitalist nation like Britain and America, right? There's something that Mussolini did. He was called the Roman genius. He was admired by people all over the world. This is all before World War II, where Mussolini lost his way, like I've told you many times before. But in terms of economics, it's very difficult with Italy in that time period because these are very difficult circumstances that they're facing. So at the end of the day, when we judge everything by this material dialectic, um, you know, corporatism, did it work? Didn't it work? I don't think we'll ever know because by the time we get to the end of the war, it's all destroyed. The, was corporatism ever really implemented? Yeah, I guess slightly in a way. But again, these problems existed as early as 1929 with the Great Depression. I can't emphasize how much that affected Italian economics. I mean, it affected the entire world. It affected America harder, obviously, than Italy, but it still affected Italy. And all these things have to be considered. And so, in terms of economics, Mussolini's record is mixed. But the question, of course, that we're trying to answer is it left wing or is it right wing? I think the fact that you have a corporatist system that's trying to bring or at least be an arbiter between capital and labor, I think to a certain degree, it's fair to say that that's left wing without a doubt. But as Nicholas Farrow notes, private property is right wing. It's anti-democratic. Now, this is a debate. Is democracy a left wing or right wing issue? I guess in terms of post Enlightenment politics, that would be left wing, right? But in terms of European historical politics, monarchy would be right wing. So it just depends, again, how you want to view these things. It's very difficult, it's very nuanced. I keep saying that. In terms of trying to bridle capitalism or trying to control unbridled capitalism, yeah, that's left wing. I think you see the socialist Marxist tendencies there in fashion when it comes to that. But notice the opposite, right? When it comes to culture, society, and morality, where the fascists put the church in power. The fascists handed morality over to the church. They handed the family and the culture to the church. That's very right wing, right? And that's what I think Farrell misses in this balance and counterbalance to try and figure out whether it's left wing or right wing at the end of the day. Um, and so that's why I say this is very difficult to judge at the end of the day. I think I think in simplest terms, if we're judging simple economics, yeah, I think you can say it's to the left. But if we take a more comprehensive approach to culture, society, and even certain elements of economics like private property, it's to the right. It's to the right, you know? And this is something that's debated all the time now between political pundits. You know, I think for me, see, I find flaws in all these systems anyways. The communist system goes against natural law. It suppresses ingenuity and true freedom, right? I'm not this absolutist on freedom, right? At least not in the libertarian sense. And then, of course, in the classical liberal world, you have the abuse of the capitalist system. It always leads to oligarchical rule. We know that now. I mean, one of the great debates going on right now in our society is the affordability of life as wealth continues to gravitate to the top, less at the bottom for a lot of young men. And now we're telling these young men maybe you got to take out a 50-year loan on your home, and maybe you got a 15-year loan on your automobiles that you buy now. Is that right wing, guys? To put somebody in perpetual debt so that the oligarchs can continue to monopolize most of the wealth. Is that right wing? No, I don't think that's right wing. I think it's pretty clear that what's happened to the West, and this is the problem with American conservatism, especially when they try to put judgments on the historical past, like something like, what was fascism, especially in the time of Benito Mussolini, is that they themselves have never come to terms with governance, right? Where classical liberals are great at philosophy, they're great at political theory, they got a lot of great ideas, but in terms of governance and practicality, they don't know how to govern. They know how to maintain this thing. This is why I keep saying, while we all celebrated the fall of the Soviet Union, here the Reagan Revolution, one of the great accomplishments, we beat the Soviet Union without firing a single shot. But the state fell. The state of the proclaimed Marxists, at least, these dividing lines we had in geopolitics, global geopolitics, but it's clear that Marxism infiltrated to all of the Western nations as well too. I think that's what the classical liberals miss, is that they had a rope-a-dope pulled on them at the end of the day. And that's why America, while we call it capitalistic, is anything but capitalistic, because the question is, can you maintain it, right? Can you maintain capitalism? Or is it all an idealistic idea? Well, is idealistic in the sense that you got a great political theory that if it works out on paper perfectly, it should be the best system in the world? Or is there something else that prevents us from being able to properly govern what capitalism is? What we have, of course, is the claim that fascism is the worship of the state. Now, there is some truth to that, all right? Some truth, right? This is what that encyclical Non Abbiamo Bisogno was about when, Pope Pius XI condemned sort of fascism and the worship of the state. I think there might have been some of that happening without a doubt. Um, but that's why you have a check and balance. It's why you have a separation between church and state, and the church is given sort of its own authority within the purview of the culture and the political system, so that the church could keep the state in check, and that's what it did in this case. We don't have that in America. As I said to you before, in America or Western liberal republics, the government becomes Holy Mother Church. It is the government that ultimately determines our morality at the end of the day, right? Look at the history of America. Who decided abortion? Supreme Court. Who decided contraception case? Supreme Court. Who decided pornography? Supreme Court. Who decided divorce and remarriage? Easy peasy divorce? The Supreme Court. Who decided gay marriage? It's Supreme Court, right? Because you effectively, again, and this is where America is more of a left-wing ideology now than even fascist Italy, you could claim, ever was, is that you have a state now that determines the morality. You could argue to me about subsidiarity and the intentions of limited government, all that crap. That's fine. It's a noble idea without a doubt. And I would agree with it in an ideological sort of as a principle. But if you can't govern it, what's the point? If you can't maintain it, what's the point? And classical liberals, in their attempt to give us limited government, local governance, they've actually given us the biggest, most intrusive, most powerful government, centralized governments in the history of the world. Much more centralized and much more powerful than, say, fascist Italy in 1920s and 30s. That's the irony of it all. Never did the fascist regime, Benito Mussolini, have the kind of power that the American government now has over its citizens. That's the irony of it all. So when you say left wing or right wing, compared to what we have in Western liberal republics today, fascism was actually to the right. It was, if you want to do that kind of a comparison, that's the irony of it all. Remember what Raquel Mussolini said in her autobiography, right, of Mussolini, right? Mussolini's wife, her book, Mussolini, an intimate biography by his widow, Rochelle Mussolini. She wrote the book in 1974. When Mussolini came into power, the first thing he had to do, as I mentioned earlier, is answer or deal with the question Romana, the loyalty and disloyalty of a nation that was artificially put together by Garibaldi and trying to figure out what Italy was in the relationship with the church, because you had a situation where you had a king that was installed effectively by Garibaldi. The king was anti-clerical, he was anti-Catholic, but Italy was a nation that was 99% Catholic at the time. And this is why the Lateran Accord actually has to come up. Mussolini has to deal with this issue at the end of the day. And ultimately, what Raquel says is, in the celebrations when throughout all of the Catholic world, the church celebrated by 1929. Well, I should say that the negotiations started in 26. It ended in 29. Lateran Accords are signed. The church has its purview. The state has its purview. The king has its purview. But Italy became effectively a Catholic nation and Catholic integralist nation, with the church being a true check and balance on government. And in some ways, the king as well, too, right? Rochelle says in her book that once the Lateran Accords were signed, that the church, the Catholic Church, basically became the third stool of Italian politics. Mussolini gave the church, well, equal footing to his government. Who would have ever thought it, right? I mean, what leader has done that historically? I'm not aware of too many. But that's effectively what happened. And this is why you could have a church and a state that ultimately butt heads. They keep checks on each other. It's a true check and balance, unlike our system, where it's a fake a check and balance, right? The judicial, the executive, the legislature, it's all one giant social club, is what it is. And this is why I say, for all the claims of the worship of the state, right? Where do we really have the worship of the state? It's Western liberal republics. It's Western liberal republics where governments decide all of our morality at the end of the day. That's what happens. It's interesting. I'm reading a book right now called Fascism by, what's his name here? I forgot his name. I don't have it in front of me. Starkey Barnes has the imprimatur of Mussolini on front of it. It discusses, talks about what fascism is. One of the things, one of the difference between fascism and Hegelian philosophy, and that is Hegel, he was a German philosopher, because a lot of people like to say that Italian fascism is based off Hegel. Well, Starchy Barnes in his book, Fascism, argues that it's not Hegelian, because the fascists made 2 points that Hegel, or well, at least that contradicted Hegel. Hegel believed, one, that the state was the end all, and two, that the state determined the morality of the nation. Fascists didn't believe in neither of those points, and they're major points. First of all, the fascists never believed that the state was the end all. And two, they believe that a moral authority, a moral arbiter of truth, had to be independent of the state. In the case of Italian fascism, that was the church through the Lateran Accords. And what did we see? Again, is this left wing? Is this right wing? Because what Mussolini did, he gave the institution of marriage to the church. the orphanages, a lot of the hospitals as well too. Mussolini banned abortion, he banned contraception, he closed down the dirty bars. He encouraged women to have children. He paid women to have children. You can say that's socialism, whatever you want to say, but he encouraged childbirth and he encouraged the family as a unit. He was a protector of the family. He thought the family was the central unit of society. Obviously, the state had a big role as well too. But is all that left wing? Is it? When Mussolini hands that to the church? Yeah, I don't think it's left wing. I don't think it's left wing. Imagine if in the West we had a government that said, okay, we're going to let the church decide on the issue of abortion. We're not going to take it to some Supreme Court, a bunch of judicial activists or a bunch of political appointees. We're actually going to take it to legitimate moral authority to decide for the nation, right? But of course, we got that little thing of individual rights that always gets in the way, right? Individual rights that are taken to an extreme in Western liberal republics to where the common good is always ostracized in the name of individual rights, but that individual rights lead to some of the greatest moral conflicts in the history of the world. It's why the Western world is in such peril today with massive moral degeneration, right? Right? Was fascism to the left or to the right? Social, family, moral, church issues? It was clearly to the right. No doubt about it. In terms of private property, it was to the right. In terms of, free transaction at the local level, it was to the right. But then again, it tended to control things at the top. It was a protectionist economy. Particularly, it wasn't a big fan of capitalistic usury. Mussolini, remember, he took one loan from J.P. Morgan when he first got into power in 1922 because the socialists in power had left him a mess, lots of deficits. He took the loan, paid off the debts, balanced the budget, and they said no thank you to the bankers after that. And that's, by the way, what World War II was about the bankers that funded both sides of the war, ironically enough. But anyway, that's for another time. Um, and so this is what upset a lot of the liberal world because it's we want to put everybody in debt at the end of the day, governments and people, right, and citizens at the end of the day, and that was something that fascists didn't believe. What worked under their basic concepts of their ideology is that to put people in debt was immoral. They rejected usury. They rejected the high finance banking system that has come to encompass the world. And you could judge for yourselves whether that's been good or bad, but we're having conversations now about affordability and life and wealth gravitating to the highest echelons of society in the West with a massive underclass now that's growing more and more. In some ways, the fascists saw this and prefigured it by its reaction by rejecting this. And for that, it's controlled. It's called a top-heavy protectionist economy. Well, I don't know. I mean, you read somebody like a Pat Buchanan, for example, that predicted a lot of the problems that America would have, the American empire, particularly with a lot of these issues that have come down the pipe. And you see that maybe a different direction. Maybe this altruistic notions of capitalism at the end of the day has consumed the West. And again, I don't want to make this cast about America and its problems, but I'm trying to give you a comparison here of what the fascists were trying to do. They were trying to keep their nation out of debt and out of the hands of the influence of bankers, especially foreigners. They wanted Italians to be Italian, to, again, create their own culture, dictate their own laws, their own moralities, their own customs, their own history. This is what they cherished. Unlike, again, a modern world where globalist ambitions are what dictates morality and economics and culture and society. And this is why everything has vanquished. Again, just trying to give a comparison here at the end of the day. So I think when we ask the question, was fascism to the left or to the right? I think it's very nuanced. And I think it's neither. I think it's neither. I think it was a right-wing reaction from a troubled time of conflict between capitalism and communism. It was definitely a right-wing reaction, but it was born of the liberal world, and they had some liberal tendencies. And again, at the end of the day, they were trying to build something bigger, apart from this material dialectic, this material transactional world, right? They believed in culture. They believed in bloodlines, ethnicity, faith, religion, history. They were trying to encompass this to create a broader culture that simply didn't focus on materialism, that there was more to the world. So we wouldn't become slaves to, again, oligarchs and banking systems at the end of the day. And what I can tell you is that culturally, things worked well in Italy. They did. My family came from Italy. Very well ordered. You know, it was a time where divorces didn't happen. It was a time where families were strong, vibrant, and big. People had children. People were faithful. People were morally sound. There's always nuance to that. Don't get me wrong. People fall. We have a fallen nature even in those times. But for the most part, the culture worked. The faith was vibrant in those days in Italy. Families were big, strong, solid, rich ideas and culture of religion. And yet that's all been wiped out in in this post-liberal world where everything promised to us in terms of material prosperity was supposed to make everything better. And in some ways, materially, yes, this post-liberal world has given us a material world of comfort. But in other ways, it's failed us because that material comfort always comes at a sacrifice. Sacrifice of family, culture, religion, faith. We see it every day. Families being destroyed. Hell, we're not even forming families anymore because there's such a distrust of the gender classes now that don't even want to get married and reproduce. I mean, look at the society we've created now, right? Under the dictates of individualism. And I'll give you a comparison here as I close this out. In Italy, the fascists implemented a bachelor's tax, right? Because for the fascists, they believe that while you had to keep some elements of individualism and incentive for people to prosper, they believe in that, and to achieve personal goals and achieve personal ambitions, they also understood that individualistic notion could become narcissistic and abusive, right? So what the fascists did was they put a bachelor tax on you until you got married because they believed that it was healthiest when men and women got married, had children, raised a family. A certain level of maturity came with that, a certain level of respect. Once you achieve that family, first of all, you provided for the nation, you reproduced, right? And you secured a future for the nation. But also, once you achieve that, then you could achieve or pursue personal ambitions after that, once you were a family man. Now, classical rules say, see, that's suppression of freedom and liberty. Okay, maybe. But we've done the opposite in the West, haven't we? In the Western liberal republics, we've told people, pursue your individual passions first, right? Pursue personal honors first. Pursue whatever it is, whatever you could dream of as an individual. If you don't want to get married, you don't even have to get married. What's this bachelor tax? That's anti-freedom, baby, right? But look at the end result of American and Western liberal society. That individualism has turned into a narcissism. Think of the dinks. Think of the blue-haired lesbians, right? Where all they do is pursue their personal inner ambitions, striving for material success, enjoying life, traveling, having a good time in life, right? That's their freedom, right? That's their freedom. And yet, unlike Italy in the 1920s and 30s, we now have dying populations in the West because nobody's having kids anymore. And quite frankly, there is a level of immaturity throughout all of our society now, precisely because being a parent matters. It matures you. Having children changes you. It gives you a different perspective in life. It makes you selfless. while not having children keeps you in a state of selfishness. This is where this individualism goes to the extreme. It goes wrong. You may not like the fact they had a tax on bachelors, but you have to understand there was a purpose. There was a purpose to it. While in our society, we put our women on contraception as soon as they turn the age of puberty, right? We sterilize our women and we tell our men that they're not worthy anymore in this feminist society. Individualism has gone to the other extreme, right? We don't want to have kids. They're too much of a burden. Instead, we'll get a puppy, little puppy, put him in our purse, and we'll travel and have a good time. And we create an absolutely sterile society where fertility rates are collapsing, where Western civilization is collapsing. That's the irony of it all. Again, whether fascism or corporatism would have worked or not, I don't know. I have my questions about it, especially the corporate system, whether it really could have worked. We'll never know because it was never given a chance. And I have my concerns about it, don't get me wrong. But in terms of understanding basic concepts of morality, civilization, culture, they had a much better grasp than this sort of laissez-faire, libertarian, freedom that we've given everybody. They understood that there was a greater purpose in the fallen nature, that if it wasn't harnessed in a certain direction, that it would all come apart. And they saw this from communism, don't get me wrong, because communism attacked the family and the faith right away, and it led to godlessness over there, right? They saw it, they experienced it. In the West, we don't take as direct of approach. We don't take as much a tyrannical sort of governance over it. Rather, we take an indifferent approach, right? We make promises of material prosperity and personal freedoms, and we got that while breaking down the faith, taking a more abstract position on religion, faith, culture, because the emphasis is material success. It's that transactional success where everything in America is a transaction, right? It goes back to this discussion happening on the right now because the capitalist system has now, which has been taken over by oligarchs. It's a system where the wealth has gravitated to the top. Most young people now, young adults, they can't buy a house and they're saying, wait a minute, how am I supposed to live here? And now the neocon answer to this is, well, America's always been a nation of migration. If you can't live where six generations of your ancestors are buried, you got to get up and move. Go to Ohio, go to Florida, go to another nation. Americans always move. That's what Americans always done. If you can't survive here, you got to leave. That's just the bottom line. And you wonder why we don't have any cultural, religious, and moral hegemony in America? You wonder why we're at each other's throats? Again, I don't want to make this about America, but my point is the fascist regime took all these things into context. They understood culture mattered. They understood faith mattered. That everything was about, let's all go make the money, and we'll be happy. Because we tried making the money. Are we happy in Western liberal republics? Are we happy? Are we? Our families are broken. We're all drugged up. We've turned to disordered lifestyles. I'll put it that way, right? And even with the material prosperity, it's limited now as less and less people are being able to partake of it. Again, I'm giving you historical parallel that there's real nuance here. There's real issues here that was brought up. And all I'm saying is that fascism was by far not a perfect system. It had its issues, without a doubt. But it considered a broader element of culture and society, religion and morality that we've never considered in the West. And now that we're collapsing, it's time to start asking these questions. Were they crazy? Were they crazy? Maybe the fascists, and this is why I say it was a right-wing, born out of the left, but it took a right-wing turn because it saw the nuttiness. It saw the evil nature of communism. It saw the nuttiness of liberalism and said, wait a minute, we don't want any of this. And that's when the entire liberal world came down on them, right? Both from the East and from the West, they said, no, 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 you're not allowed to exist. And that's essentially what World War II was. It was the final nail in the coffin of Christendom. Christendom was destroyed by liberalism. The fascists, they were the last political entity to try and protect against this. And they were crushed because of this. So there you have it. Fascism, is it to the left or is it to the right? Good luck trying to figure it out, guys. This is Frank. Signing off, Frank speaking. Good night, everybody.